Hello and welcome to Round Table. As the UK's Conservative Party stumbles from one crisis to another, Labour sees the chance of returning to power after 12 years in opposition, during which time it's faced accusations of anti-Semitism. However, as it clears up one mess, the Labour Party stands accused of turning its back on working-class voters, refusing to back calls for strikes during a cost of living crisis, and of treating minorities with contempt. Is this really a springboard to power? Very good to have you with us. I'm David Foster. Keir Starmer, the leader of the UK's opposition party Labour, believes that Liz Truss's government could fall at any time. According to polls, Labour could take advantage of Ms Truss's mismanagement of the economy, which has seen inflation and interest rates soar while the pound tumbles. However, damning reports of racism within the Labour Party have emerged, highlighted in Al Jazeera's Labour Files investigation and the party's own Ford report. So, does the Labour Party still represent all people, or is it offloading its core voters as it tries to appeal to middle ground? With me in the studio, we have Sebastian Milbank, political commentator and online editor of The Critic magazine. We go to Scotland, to Inverness, way up north. Lord Clive Soley, former Labour MP, now in the House of Lords. To Watford, in the UK, Lester Holloway joins us from there, editor of The Voice, Britain's only African and Caribbean national newspaper, and in Oxford, Halima Khan, former chair of the Labour Party's Black, Asian and Minority Ethnic Staff Network. We're going to deal with racism first as part of this programme, which is about Labour's prospects. Thanks for joining us. Clive Soley, you've been in the Labour Party for I don't know how long. You may care to tell me, you may care not to. But when you hear something that came up in this film, this journalistic film called The Labour Files, lots of details released that were not supposed to be released about communications within the party. And you see a black Labour councillor saying, I've faced more racism in the Labour Party than I have in the rest of my life combined. Do you recognise the Labour Party of 2022?
Not to that extent, no. I'd be a foolish person who said there isn't still a racism problem in Britain generally and in the Labour Party. But I do think we dealt with the anti-Semitism bit rather well, and I know Keir Starmer is particularly strong on that, where I think that there is always going to be problems, too much, but there's going to be still problems around, is I think in some areas and with some groups where people still haven't learned the subtleties and either come out with sort of hidden racist views or sometimes very blatant ones, and they need to be dealt with very firmly. And I think we are beginning to do that.
Can we go to you, Halima? Because Clive Soley there is saying, yes, we dealt with anti-Semitism pretty well, but this is one of the damning indictments of the Ford inquiry, which was set up to look into the anti-Semitism of the Labour Party. And that is that, yes, that was okay, but other forms of discrimination within the party were pushed to one side. And you had to deal with that. You believe you saw that firsthand, Halima?
Yes, I mean, I speak as someone who is highly critical of the errors of the previous leadership in relation to the anti-Semitism crisis, creating a hierarchy of racism, which was then exasperated by the current Starmer leadership. When Keir came into leadership, there were a number of internal reviews, with Organised to Win 2024 being a key indicator of the direction in which we were heading. Now, the action plan involved mass sackings in the middle of a pandemic, including the most diverse units, without an equalities impact assessment, therefore disproportionately impacting BAME members of staff. Now, as chair of the BAME staff network, we were routinely ignored by Keir and his office when we tried to convene a meeting to raise the issue that half of our network will be effectively pushed out. The BAME staff practically had to beg the General Secretary to follow the Equality and Human Rights Commission's best practice guidelines, to the point that out of desperation, the network ended up having to conduct its own surveys to understand how many BAME staff will be impacted by the review. Now, if Keir, as leader of the Party of the Workers, ignored serious concerns from his own Black and minority and Muslim staffs, I have zero confidence that the lay public will be listened to. What we saw in the Labour files were how his team referred to concerns raised by the Black Lives Matter protests as a culture war, which they believed was in conflict to the interests of the Red Wall voters. Now, the other key
So hang
thing
on,
that was...
these issues were ignored because they wouldn't go down well with the Red Wall voters. Is that what you're saying?
That's what I believe was the direction of the Labour Party.
Can I bring this up with Sebastian in the studio, because I want to bring it. Why would we find the Labour Party with this sort of face towards the general public in 2022?
Oh, well, I don't think we are, is the simple answer. I think the idea that the Labour Party has not spent enough time on the question of race in the last 10 years is something I think few people who read the headlines have had the impression of. It's something that we seem to debate constantly.
But perhaps only debating one side of it, as opposed to all sides.
Well, I actually agree about this. The problem is the debate's been very narrow, and I think we've done something very dangerous in making it party political. That whenever we say race, which is a problem for all of us in society, it's a British problem. It's not a Labour problem. It's not a Conservative problem. And the moment people try to weaponise it to say this leader, this party, this group has a racism problem, we get into trouble. And I think we've also made it too simple. Racism is not a monolith. We often treat it as just as people who have malice. And of course, there are people like that, and we need to deal with them. There's also racial tensions between ethnic groups. Go on.
I mentioned the Ford report. Set up in response to allegations about anti-Semitism. And this is one of the lines. Cases related to anti-Semitism and the importance they appear to play, in effect, a hierarchy of racism or of discrimination, with other forms of racism and discrimination being ignored. For a party that seeks to be a standard bearer of progressive politics, equality and workers' rights, this is an untenable situation. This is not anti-Semitism under Jeremy Corbyn. This is the Labour Party of 2022 under the man behind me, Sir Keir Starmer, who hopes to be the UK's next Prime Minister. He hasn't dealt with it.
Okay, so the question is, what are we really talking about here? So the issue is that this becomes the Labour Party talking to itself about itself, and that is not a position to win the next election. That we want the leaders of political parties, what people want to hear from them is how they're going to change their lives. They don't care about their staffing arrangements. They don't care about who said what to who about what. They want to know what they're going to do to change structural inequality in this country, whether that's about class or about race or about sex. And that's what the Labour Party needs to be focusing on.
Okay, but doesn't it come down to fundamentally how good a person you actually are if you address this sort of thing, rather than whether you're going to knock a penny off the income tax? This deals with the morality of the people at the top.
Yeah, the questions of virtue should be paramount in politics. I don't think we should push them aside for policy. But I think the question of character here cannot just be a question of, did you say a mean thing about somebody, or did you hire this person? It's something more fundamental, which is, do people conduct themselves in a way that is honourable? Do they treat people well? Are they consistent in what they say?
But perhaps it's outward facing, isn't it? Let me bring you into this. Perhaps it's saying the right thing in public, while in private you're finding out about the real character of the people in the organisation.
Well, I think the first thing to say really is that I think Sebastian is wrong to say that this is just a problem with the whole of society, and so the Labour Party is as affected as anybody else, because I think that's just simply not good enough. The Labour Party should believe in equality. It should believe in anti-racism. And many people in the party believe it does. So therefore, it's got to live that.
No, but my point is that may be what people are saying, that they don't believe that racism is a good thing, but actually they don't really care.
Well, I think about not really care. I think it's really about political will to deal with the culture in the party, because ultimately these problems are happening at a local level. You quoted Marcia Hutchinson, someone that The Voice has interviewed previously in Manchester, who was actually saying she's experienced more racism in the Labour Party than in the rest of her life. That was to do with the culture, I think, in that local area. So what the Labour Party needs to do in order to really win the confidence of the black community around the country, which I think it is starting to lose, which is a problem for it electorally, is to actually have the will to not just put on a few anti-racism training at party conferences, which very few people go to, but it's actually to get to grips and change the culture so that it is welcoming, that people do understand the need not just to avoid being sort of nasty or whatever, but to actually have a genuinely welcoming culture, which is actually embracing and welcoming in people from all backgrounds, so that they can participate and feel that this is a place that they want to be.
Okay, Clive, why do you think the Labour Party, or some individuals in the Labour Party who've been accepted by the movement, and we will move off racism in just a moment, but why do you think they are exclusionary? When I've always thought of the Labour Party as being a bigger, warmer blanket, at least that's what it wants to portray itself as around society.
I think it is largely, but I think you've got to focus on particular areas and problems. I mean, in a way, the anti-Semitism one was a classic example of a group of people, some of whom were really massively anti-Semitic, others who were confusing the Palestine issue with the Jewish question, i.e. the Jewish question being, are you Jewish or are you not Jewish? And there was a tendency to conflate the two. And you got that in other areas. Now, again, look at the wider picture. One of the things that most interested me recently is Boris Johnson came out with some most appalling racist comments, if you remember. And yet he's got, and had, until he was ceased to be Prime Minister, an incredibly mixed race cabinet. And in a way, that's what the Labour Party has to do. You have to be seen by people, to be giving opportunities to people from all backgrounds so that it's not exclusionary. It's a complex problem, but I really don't accept that Labour Party is some fundamentally racist. I think obviously you will have racist people in it. You'll also, more importantly, have some people have difficulty getting the language or attitudes or values right, because it is a complex area where people, use language that's out of date or wrong. So I think you have to be a bit careful about saying this is all just wicked, racist in the Labour Party. It's not. It's much.
So Halima, let me ask you, bearing in mind that Sir Keir Starmer hopes to be the next UK Prime Minister, and also taking into account the fact that the Ford Reporter suggested under his leadership certain racist issues have been ignored. Is he the right person to be given the keys to the country?
Well, personally, I feel that the current leadership is not fit to lead his own party, let alone the country. Now, when we talk about the Newham dossier that was disclosed in episode 3 of the Labour Files, it was clear to me that an act of criminality had occurred in relation to how the dossier was compiled. The party had received this dossier in February 2021 and acted on the allegations immediately, suspending the whole of Newham, the most diverse borough in London, and reported the individuals mentioned in the dossier to the Met Police. Now, the dossier came to me months after the suspension to investigate the allegations, and I was mortified to the levels of stalking that was involved of the entire South Asian community, with special attention to Muslim members. We're talking of thousands of people here. And the dossier was sent to David Evans, the General Secretary of the Labour Party, so he was aware.
I do get, a lot of people won't understand the specifics, but I do get what you're driving at. Can I go back to the original point? You said you don't want him to lead the Labour Party, let alone the country. Is there any chance of the Labour Party getting rid of him?
In the current state, what we're seeing now is the silence of British mainstream media as well as Labour MPs, democratically elected individuals by the British public, who have quite literally been whipped by the leadership to only speak on matters that serve him. This was not what happened under Corbyn. We saw how publicly his own MPs turned on him, and they had the agency to do so. Whereas the current climate is that most Black and Brown MPs are terrified about speaking against the grain, to even show solidarity to Black and Muslim members of the Labour Party who are subject to discriminatory and potentially criminal practices by the party.
Okay, we're going to move slightly away from the racism side of things, because we have to talk about Labour in the round here, if I may. And Sebastian, this was an opinion poll that was taken just after the mini budget that has proved to be quite unpopular for the new Prime Minister, Liz Truss. The question was, what do you think is the most likely result of the next general election? 1 in 3 reckon Labour will win, 14% of those reckoning it will be a big majority. 1 in 8, a Labour minority government they expect. 15% believe the Conservatives will retain their majority at the next election, which means 85% don't, and 11% think there'll be a hung parliament once again. So the Conservatives would have to go into bed with one of the minority parties. Is Labour winning when it's so far ahead in the polls, or is it simply a result of the Tories being absolutely useless?
Oh, well, both. Which is that by being absolutely useless, the Tories have ensured that the Labour Party is in a position to win. But if they want to stay in a position to win, they're going to have to work very hard.
So if it weren't for the fact that the Tories were, as you suggested, not doing a particularly good job, where would Labour stand? I mean, how strong is it at the moment? Does it have an identity?
I think it has an identity, but I think it's quite a weak one at the moment. And I think it's lost a lot of its identity. So that I think historically Labour has been the party of the working peoples. But first of all, that's become confusing both on the sense of that Labour has not always been on the side of where working people are politically in the last 10 years, but also that what a working class person is today is a much harder thing to diagnose because more people identify as white collar or middle class than ever before, yet at the same time, a lot of people who consider themselves middle class are poorer than they've ever been before. And I think Labour has not done a good job of talking to the middle of the country, talking to people who are middle class, but they're struggling to stay in the middle class.
Okay, so you would suggest, if one looked at it dispassionately, that Labour would be the right home for working people, but they have migrated either through a sense of sort of wanting to sort of get one over on anybody else, move up the social ladder, if you like. They've migrated to the middle ground. Perhaps they feel like they are represented better by the Conservative Party. But what has Labour done to alienate them?
Well, I think one problem is that Labour has moved away from its traditional values, which were about upholding a traditional patriotic socialism. And it's moved away. It's moved in a sense both right and left in different directions. So it's moved left in the sense of abandoning a belief in this country and its culture, its traditions. But it's moved right in the sense it's moved away from having a strong belief in the ability of the state to do good and having a strong belief in the values of public service. And that union was always what made sense of Labour. The sense is it was the party of solidarity, the party of belonging. And that was an inclusive idea of belonging. You know, people could come and join that sense of unity, but they did express that unity. And I think under Blair, a lot of that was lost. And I think in the years since, they've struggled to recover.
Like the selfish Labour Prime Minister.
Yeah, if you like.
Okay, let me ask you this. What do you think when you look at the Labour Party these days? One of the things we've already mentioned is that the Tory party is much more diverse in terms of the number of senior representatives it have of BAME background. But what do you think of the Labour Party now? Has it got a soul?
Well, yes, and I think that many people, many of our readers, the vast majority of them vote Labour, would actually like to see the Labour government rather than the Conservative government. But what I would say is that they need an offer that really excites them, and it's not just about pitching to the middle. It's also about pitching to the issues that many people are faced. So we've got to deal with the housing crisis that particularly renters face. We've got to deal with the bottom as well. Black communities are twice as likely to be, in poverty. So we've got to deal with the issue of systemic racism as well. We've got to have policies that tackle that. And if we're going to have radical policies, then the Labour Party has got to have time to sell them to the public. Because if they're going to leave it until the last minute, they're not going to be radical because at that time everyone starts to get a little bit scared.
So let me ask you this:
horses.
Given the fact that there are many reports that Keir Starmer has put his senior executive onto a war footing because he believes a general election is actually quite likely, and given the state of the polls, let's step ahead a little bit and think that Labour could actually be forming the next government fairly soon. Isn't it going to inherit exactly the same problems that the Tory government has at the moment and find itself facing a voter backlash pretty quickly?
Well, I think it comes down to exciting the public. I mean, if we look, for example, at 2017 election, which did actually happen, that excited a lot of people who, young people, ethnic minorities. The Running Trust did a survey which actually found that, with many ethnicities, including Black, African and Caribbean people, the support for the Labour Party was in the over 90%. So, that base needs to be excited. But at the same time, what Keir Starmer, I think, promised in his election campaign was that he would be better at Corbyn at reaching out to the middle, to winning Conservative voters as well. That was essentially the pitch. Now what we need to see that delivered. We need to have those exciting policies that are going to speak to people who are disadvantaged, that have been hammered by the system. And we expect Keir Starmer to also reach out to the middle as well. That's what he promised to do. That's what I think he needs to deliver.
Clive, let me ask you this. I mean, many people have suggested that he was chosen because he was the antithesis of Jeremy Corbyn, who was dangerous, who was edgy, who perhaps could not be trusted. This was a man who'd been Director of Public Prosecutions. He was solid, if you like, stolid also. Do you think Labour made a mistake in picking somebody who some have suggested really doesn't have the charisma to be able to lead a party? Let the slogans speak for themselves.
No, I don't think that. And one of the reasons I don't is I think the thing that Britain needs more than anything else at the moment in politics is integrity, because that's what went missing, seriously missing, under Boris Johnson. So I think the integrity, it does matter in politics. But secondly, let's remember some of the basic political issues. First of all, governments lose elections as much as oppositions win them. Secondly, you will not win an election in Britain unless you are getting the middle ground as well as your basic supporters, and that applies on either side. And thirdly, what matters in the next election is for the Labour Party to have a credible economic policy. And I think under Rachel Reeves, who's the Shadow Chancellor, that is emerging quite fast. But it is vitally important. Why? Because at the moment, the Tories have lost the economic argument big time. And it will be very difficult for them to get it back again, because mortgage effects and savings effects are long term. So people don't forget those, whereas they'll forget other issues, including, sadly, about race and things of that nature. So you have to win that middle ground. And someone said a few moments ago, quite rightly, that the Labour Party has to be seen as patriotic again after Corbyn. We lost a lot of those red wall seats because of that. And yet now you can see us, A, developing a sensible economic policy, B, you actually have, the Union flag flying when Starmer is speaking and singing the national anthem, which is actually winning back those red wall Labour voters. And that is important. So yes, we can win the next election under Keir Starmer. I actually think he'll be a bit of a Clem Attlee figure. You're right to say he's not charismatic in the way that Tony Blair was or whatever. But you don't have to be that. Clem Attlee was not charismatic. I know it was before television was as powerful as it is now, but you can win it because people believe in you and what you're doing, and that's where integrity matters.
But part of the problem, I think, and let me come to you, Halima, on this, is that as Lester has suggested, given time, the policies might be appealing to the public. They would have a chance to understand them, take them all in, and see the man for what he is. But as he is suggesting, a general election could come very soon, and there won't be time for that. Does Labour spell out enough of what it means at the moment to be a credible force in government?
I mean, I don't think it does. And, obviously my personal experience is actually from being inside the belly of the beast, per se, rather than what I've seen, when these politicians come out and make those statements, So I've seen everything that happens behind closed doors, which are of importance because that's where the truth lies. Now, the question of whether or not the UK Labour Party is fit to govern relies upon whether or not the British public have faith in Starmer having control of our policing and intelligence services, if, as exposed in the Labour files, is how he behaves in opposition. The British public need to ask themselves whether or not we are prepared to waiver our democratic rights in the essence of what makes us proud to be British, to elect a prime minister who holds democratic processes at sheer discontent in favour of bureaucratic gagging of open and fair discussion.
Let me come to you, Sebastian, if I may. We would all like a government that stands for things that are probably better than ourselves. Integrity, honesty, charismatic, etc., etc. Is it possible that we are going to see that with the next government in this country, or are we simply facing the least worst option?
Well, we're certainly facing the least worst option, because I think after we've seen what we've seen with Boris Johnson and with Liz Truss, we've seen a mixture of a lack of integrity and incompetence that will be hard for a Labour government to to be any worse. I think integrity is something that one has to discover in practice. It's something we'll have to see when someone's in government. I don't think I have to disagree about this idea that Starmer has shown a contempt for democratic values. I think that is actually an absurd exaggeration because, I think part of the problem with this is that an awful lot of people in the Labour Party are very obsessed with Labour internal politics and they're very obsessed with party machinery.
Right.
And they see party machinery as democratic. But the party machinery is not democratic. And even if it were, everything were up for open vote, it wouldn't be because the party...
Does the public give a damn anyway?
They don't give a damn. And the problem is that MPs are elected by the public. First of all, that's their source of legitimacy, not the party. And it's important that the party has an input and that the party has confidence. But the party should not confuse itself with a country, especially when it's a few 100,000 people in a country of tens of millions.
Well, let's not forget it was the Conservative Party that gave us this current Prime Minister. It wasn't the people of the country as a whole. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. Good to see you, Clive. Nice to see you, Gleam, as well. Thanks for coming on the programme. Sebastian, nice to meet you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Keep up the good work at The Critic. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks for watching this programme. I'm David Foster from all of us at Round Table.